Rochester, New York, in the United States, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to speak some English, and we're going to see if that works, and if not, then I'll speak a little bit of English, and he will speak a little bit of something you understand more than my English. So I am traveling with my family. I spent some of the day in Moldova. I'm spending 3 or 4 days in Romania, and then I'm flying to Georgia and Armenia. So it's a holiday for me. But I knew I was going to be in the area, and I knew of Dr. Jordana's work, and she does work in my area. So I contacted her, and we set this up, and I'm very excited to meet you personally and to meet the fellow faculty and to be here to talk with all of you. Do you want to check or do you know?
Traducere? Those who need translation, they don't speak.
Okay.
That's my conclusion.
Okay.
But we may continue. If somebody doesn't understand, actually, I don't say legge, I'm here just in case.
So just English still?
Just English.
Okay. So what I want to do today is try to communicate about my research on achievement motivation. And I'm going to go through a number of slides that describe my theoretical ideas. But I'm also going to talk about studies that I've done that empirically test the ideas. If I have time at the end, I will also talk about how these can be applied to everyday life. I'm going to talk about competition and achievement motivation. I call it a hierarchical motivational analysis. So I'm going to be talking about competition. And I like talking about these things to audiences like yourself because it's conceptually and theoretically interesting, I think, I hope, but I know it's directly applicable to every one of your lives. Every one of you here is in an academic context. You're either a teacher, an administrator, or a student. And so all of you are trying to do well or trying to avoid doing poorly in what you are doing here at the university. And so what I'm going to be doing is providing you with theory, but you can also apply it to your life as I'm talking. So think about it in 2 levels, as an academic and as a person who struggles with sometimes or is wrestling with these issues on a regular basis. So let me dive in. So the first thing I want to do is define what I mean by competition. What I'm going to be talking about in terms of competition is one person being compared to another person or persons, and only one person can do well compared to that other person. So there's other kinds of competition. There's teams, like football teams playing against each other. That's group competition. I'm not going to be talking about that. I'm going to be talking about mostly individuals like students competing against another student. And I want to talk about the motivation that happens around that, in that situation. So, the first thing I want to say is that competition is basic and it's ubiquitous. Competition is basic, meaning it's in all of us. And I have a cartoon. This is dangerous to do this across languages. Oftentimes, what's funny to me isn't funny to you in another language. It's not laugh out loud funny, but it's just, I think it's funny. So first came the opposable thumb, then came competitive sports. So ideas like this is basic. Back in the caveman or women days, there was competition. And then the other point is competition is ubiquitous. Ubiquitous means it's everywhere. It's not only at university, but it's also maybe in your relationships with your friends. You're trying to do better than your friends at something. Maybe you're even in your hobby growing tomatoes in your garden, and you're trying to grow better tomatoes than other people. So competition and that urge to compare yourself to others and then either do better than them or not do worse than them is all over. And I've got a cartoon for this as well. This is, are you serious? Look at our arms. If anything, I'm twice as tan as you are. So they're stranded, right? But they're still competing against each other on silly things like how dark their skin is. So a question I want to ask for you, and a main question that I've looked at in my work is competition good for you or is it bad for you? And I think all of you have intuitive understandings of this idea. And some of you would say, I think competition helps me perform well. Others of you, I'm guessing, would say competition is a disaster for me. It makes me do worse, right? And there are theories in psychology that are in both of those camps. Some theorists say competition is good for performance. Other theorists say competition undermines performance. And so I've written some quips or some quotes that illustrate this. So for the competition is good, a horse never runs as fast as when he has other horses to catch up and outpace. So that's a Roman poet, Ovid. That's the idea of competition helps you do better. But then there's the negative side, and that's competitions are for horse, not artists. So that's the idea that competition really makes us, it plays to the most basic side of us, and it's not really going to help us perform in a creative way, let's say. And that's the Hungarian composer Bela Bartok. So it's ambiguous in theory, and I'm struggling here with this. There we go. And so I want to ask you to kind of internally in your head vote for which of these positions is the one that you think is right. And then I'm going to tell you which one I think is right later on, so you can see if we match or don't match. So competition is good is one option. Competition is bad for performance is another option. Both are wrong, so that would mean that there's no actual relationship between competing and how you perform. And the fourth is both of these positions are correct. Sometimes competition is good, and sometimes competition is bad. I'm going to take you through these possibilities, and we're going to come out the other end, and I'm going to tell you what I think is the right answer. That doesn't mean it is, but it means it's the one that I think is right, and I'm the one who's talking, so I get to have a position. But you may disagree. So this question and the answer to it is very important. It's very important for yourself as to what you're going to decide to embrace in your own urges and desires. If you're competitive, are you going to say, I'm competitive and I like that about myself and I'm going to dive in and be competitive? Or are you going to fight that in yourself? Are you going to say, I'm competitive and I don't like that and I'm going to try not to be competitive? And the same with teachers and coaches and employers. As people who are socializing others in these roles, are we going to encourage competition or at least not discourage it in our students, in our workers, in our players? Or are we going to fight it and encourage them to not compete and try to discourage it? Parents, it's the same way. I have 3 kids. One of my kids is traveling with me actually. Right now he's walking around town. I hope he's okay. But do I encourage him to compete? Or do I discourage him to compete? Or do I just let him compete? So these are important questions, not just for theory, but for everyday life and application. And so what I'm going to do now is talk about the motivational idea or the motivational piece of competitiveness. And I have to start with definitions of things like motivation and goals. And some of you may think that's really basic, that's really rudimentary. we all know what motivation is. We all know what a goal is. I disagree. And I disagree because if you put 10 motivation psychologists in a room and ask them to write down a definition of motivation, you're going to get 10 different definitions from those people. So it's very much debated, and I want to share with you my definition and why I think it's important to define it clearly and define it the way that I define it. So I'm going to define motivation as the energization and direction of behavior, and I'm going to argue that it's important to understand that there's two pieces to motivation. There's the energization piece, and that's separate from the direction piece, but you need both to understand what motivation really is. So let me unpack that a little bit. And those of you who like studies, wait a minute, I'm getting there. But I want to lay out the theory first before I dive into the studies. But don't worry, I'm going to get there. So some people might be like, when's he going to talk about data? And I'm getting there. And maybe I'm not getting there, actually. Shoot. Oh, there we go. Okay. There we go. So the first part of motivation is energization. And I look at energization as that, I call it the initial instigation or spring to action. So this has been talked about since the guy William James, often thought of as one of the founders of scientific psychology, at least in America. And the function of this is to activate you, to get you moving in some or thinking in some direction. So it's a desire you have, or it's a fear you have. Think about when you desire something, when you fear something, it gets you energized, it gets you activated, right? And so these are often talked about in terms of motives and values and things like that. But energization is not all of motivation, there's also direction. And direction is the guiding or channeling of behavior. And the idea here is that you have a general desire or a general fear, but that doesn't tell you what to do, right? And so goals, which are, and strategies, channel the desire toward a specific thing that you can work toward to address that desire, or a specific thing to avoid to get away from that fear that you might have. So the hierarchical analysis that I'm arguing for is that, first of all, consider energization and direction separate. Second, realize both of them are necessary to fully understand motivation. A lot of motivational theorists only talk about energization and call it motivation. Others only talk about goals and call it motivation. I'm going to argue both of those are incomplete. To really understand motivation, you need to have both together. And the idea here is to separate them out and then put them back together into a full model of motivation. Now, I just gave you a lot of information. And what I'm going to do now is show you studies that illustrate these ideas, that unpack these ideas. So if right now you're like, what's he talking about? Even if he was speaking my language, I wouldn't know what he's talking about. Just hang in there, because I'm going to illustrate this and unpack this with specific studies, concrete studies. So the one other piece of information I have to tell you is that competitiveness, which is what I'm really going to focus on in these studies, can be thought of in three ways. It can be thought of as a trait. We walk around, we walked into this room with a certain level of trait competitiveness. Some of you are competitive all the time. Some of you are almost never competitive. That's trait competitiveness. The other is perceived environmental competitiveness. You look at the environment and you say, I see a lot of people being competitive there, or not, right? And then finally, there's structural competition. There's just situations you walk into and it's clear only one person can win, and that's a competition. So those are three ways to think about competitiveness. And what we did in our research is we linked those two goals. And here's where I want to show you my achievement goal model. And what I want to do is just focus on two parts of this model. I want to focus on performance approach goals and performance avoidance goals. These are goals that are about using others as a standard of excellence. So the goal of trying to do well compared to others is performance approach goals. It's a positive goal of approaching success, and you're using a normative standard or others to decide if you're doing well or not. And then a performance avoidance goal, you are focusing on a negative possibility of avoiding failure, and you're comparing yourself to others. So I'm going to try to avoid doing poorly compared to others. Here they are. Here are the two goals that I'm really going to focus on today. Performance goals with striving to attain competence relative to others. Try to be better than others. Okay, here I want to bring it back to your everyday life. Think about yourself at work. Think about yourself at school. Think about yourself as a teacher, as a student. To what degree are you trying to do better than others in your work? Some of you might say a lot, that's all the time. Others of you may say, I don't do that at all. Try not to do worse than others. To what degree do you focus on trying to avoid doing poorly or not doing worse than other people? Right? Really think about that. And what I'm going to show you is that it really matters for your outcomes, for how you experience achievement situations, which goal you adopt. Okay? All right, so we started this work by doing a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis, collect all the studies that have been done on a topic, put them together, and then see what the overall effect is. So we started with trait competitiveness. We got 58 studies with 11,000 some participants, and we did the meta-analysis, and what we found is that the average relationship between competitiveness at the trait level and performance is 0.049. That's really, really small. It is significant and it's positive, but it's almost zero, is the bottom line. And what we're going to see is that this is the largest it gets. So when we go to perceived competitiveness, 30 studies, 11,000, it's a completely zero relationship. In other words, there is no overall relationship between competitiveness at the perceived level and performance. What about manipulated competitiveness? The relationship is non-significant. It's basically zero. So, right now, who's winning? Where are we? The competition is good camp, no. Competition is bad camp, no. Right now, it's both are wrong. Okay, now, let me take a step back and tell you that this isn't what we thought we were going to find. And it's not what we wanted to find, because we thought we're going to make half the people in the literature mad. Either the people that thought competition was good, if we find that competition is bad in the meta-analysis, we're going to make them mad, and vice versa, right? So, but we thought we were at least going to make some people happy. But no, we're making everyone mad. That's right. We're saying nobody's right. Both camps are wrong. So if you are voting, if you voted internally and you had one of the first two, we're going to argue that's probably not the right answer. Right? I'm going to do a question and answer at the end of this, and you can ask questions and you can disagree, and that's totally fine, and I'd love to hear your ideas on this. But for right now, we're going to say number 3 is the right answer. We may or may not end up here, but right now we're going to say number 3 is the right answer. So let me show you some studies that we did to try to make sense of this, I call it kind of a thud. It's a disappointing result, right? And confusing result. Let me show you what we did to try to figure it out. We argued that competitiveness may not have a direct relationship to performance, but that competitiveness may lead to performance approach goals. If you're really competitiveness in general, and you walk into an achievement situation, you probably try to do well compared to others in that situation as your goal, and that guides your behavior. The same, if you're competitiveness, you probably also, or at least some people, end up trying to avoid doing poorly compared to others. That's the other part. So in other words, competitive desires lead to competition-based goals, both approach goals and avoidance goals. That's the first part of this. Now the second part is based on a lot of research that a lot of people have done. And that is that we find that if you're trying to do well compared to others, you usually do well compared to others. That's what that plus is up there. So if you try to do well compared to others, you persist, you put in a lot of effort, and you end up doing really well. Now, the lower part is performance avoidance goals, and this is ironic. if you're trying to avoid doing poorly compared to others, the data clearly show you end up doing worse than others. Why would that be? It's kind of weird, it's kind of ironic. It's because if you're trying to avoid doing poorly compared to others, you get anxious, you're ruminative, you're thinking about what if I blow it, what will others think, and that distracts you and you end up doing worse than you would have done otherwise. So what we're arguing here is that the competitiveness leads to these two goals which have opposing effects on performance, and they cancel each other out to make it zero overall. Do you get that? If you collapse the positive and the negative together, you get zero. That's what you do in meta-analysis, but it's masking all of this action through the goals. And so we did a study where it's a very simple study. We assessed trait competitiveness in a bunch of students at the university. And then we assessed their performance approach and performance avoidance goals. And then we had them take an exam. So going back to this model, we assessed competitiveness, we assessed achievement goals for an exam, and then we got their exam scores. And the question is, what does the data look like? Does it look like what we anticipated? And first of all, here's what we found for the relationship between trait competitiveness and overall performance on the exam. Nothing, zero, which is exactly what we got in the meta-analysis. But the question is that masking the opposing processes? And that's exactly what we found. So the trait competitiveness leads to both of those kind of goals, but the approach goals lead to good performance, the avoidance goals lead to bad performance. So the take-home message here, well actually let me continue on the other, we did the same thing with perceived performance, so I'm not going to go over this in detail. I just want to show you again a null effect, and then the same relationship that's opposing processes. This is exactly what I showed you for trait competitiveness. And then I'm going to go through this quickly. We did another study with actual competition. Actually, I've taken that out. So we did another study with actual competition, saw the same thing. So here's the summary, and now we're looking at number 4 is correct. Both camps are correct. Sometimes it's good and sometimes best. So sometimes competitiveness leads to good outcomes if what? They lead to performance approach goals. Sometimes they lead to bad outcomes if what? They lead to performance avoidance goals. So now we're back in everybody's happy, right? We were in that awful place of everyone's mad. Now we're in everybody's happy, but not like super happy, but just a little bit happy, a little bit mad. So this is what I'm going to argue is the best way to think about the effect of competition on performance. Now let me link it back to the theory. If you just look at energization, which is competitive desires, what effect does energization alone have on performance? Zero effect. So if you only look at motivation as energization, and you're looking at a competitiveness analysis, you would say motivation doesn't matter for performance outcomes. But you need to bring in the direction, and the direction is the goals. And if you have both together, then you know that competitive desires lead to, they're channeled into these goals, and then the goals have the direct and proximal impact on achievement outcomes. So you need both energization direction, both competitiveness, desires, and achievement goals to understand these kind of things. So what I want to do is take you through some other studies we've done that follow on this and unpack this more. So we've done some studies that look at projection. The idea here is if I'm competitive, if I have high trait competitiveness, do I see competitiveness in you? Do I project my own competitive desires onto you? And then do both of those, the trait competitiveness and the projected competitiveness, do both of those influence my goal adoption? So we did a simple study where we, with US undergrads, we assessed trait competitiveness and perceived class competitiveness, and then achievement goals. It's exactly the same as what I've shown you before. Really simple study. but we added both trait competitiveness and perceived competitiveness measures. So the first question is over here on the left, and the question is, does your amount of trait competitiveness influence how you perceive competitiveness in others? And the answer is yes. So if you're a competitive person, you walk into a classroom and it seems to you like everyone's competing with each other. And this isn't what we study, but let me just spool that out of it. And then you probably act more competitively, and others see that and they get competitive. So it's a kind of a spiral, right? It kind of works off of each other. So that's what we found, is that indeed people project their competitive desires onto others. And then the rest of the piece here is exactly what I've shown you before, that both trait competitiveness leads to a performance approach and performance avoidance goal adoption, and perceived competitiveness does the same. They do so at the same time. So that's study 1. Study 2, we just replicated that, but we took it all the way to achievement, and we found that indeed both the trait and the projected competitiveness lead to goals, which lead to outcomes. Okay? I'm going to skip a few things just for time purposes. I'm not going to get into this. I'm not going to get into this. Sorry. This is what I really want to show you. This is my newest work, and I'm really, really excited about this. This is taking this model and these ideas to everyday life of people in the economy. So here, we use something called MTurk. How many of you know what MTurk is? Have heard of MTurk? Mechanical Turk? It's a web program where you can put studies up on the web, and people sign up for them, and you can collect your data on the web. So it's a really good way to collect data. There's issues with it, but by and large, it's a way to get data quickly. So what we did is we acquired U.S. zip codes and Gini coefficients for zip codes. So zip codes are the small local regions in the United States. I don't know what the equivalent is here. Postal code, right? So we got the local area, and we got the Gini coefficient, which is the amount of economic inequality in that postal code. And it ranges from 0 to 1. 1 means there's one person in that zip code who holds all of the income. 0 means every single person in the postal area has the same amount of income in their job. So what it's getting at is income inequality. This is a very, very hot topic in social science right now, in economics and politics and psychology, sociology. So what we're looking at here is, to what degree does income inequality in a region influence people's perceptions that there's a lot of competition in that region? So we measured perceived competitiveness, and we assessed achievement goals, performance approach, performance avoidance goals, and some other things as well. We controlled for things like poverty level and things like that. So what we want to know is, does this competition model that I've already talked about, does it link up to broad economic indicators? Does income inequality in the place that you live lead you to see more competitiveness in people around you? And does that lead you to be more competitive, both approach and avoidance based? And here's what we found. So indeed, objective income inequality, the more unequal the distribution of wealth is in your postal code, the more you see people as competitive in your postal code. And the more you see them as competitive in your postal code, the more they adopt performance approach goals, and the more they adopt performance avoidance goals. I'm gonna ignore mastery goals for now, because I just don't have time to get into that. So this part of the model is exactly what I've shown you already, and we're linking it to broad economic indicators of income inequality. And for me, this is exciting because it takes this theoretical idea that we had in the lab and in the classroom, And it shows that these things are happening out in the real world around things like economic inequality in situations. So I'm going to wrap up now. And I want to wrap up in two ways. One is I want to tell you where we're going with this research. And then I also want to ask a couple of applied questions. Then I'm going to open it up for your questions or your comments. Okay? So the next step, I think that the clear next step is to focus on what are called moderators of the competition or competitiveness achievement goal link. Here's what I mean by this, is what we showed is that competition by itself isn't good or bad for outcomes. Competition is good for outcomes like achievement if it leads to performance approach goals, which lead to positive implications for achievement. It's bad if it leads to performance avoidance goals. So what's the clear next thing we need to do? What is it that makes people who are competitive go up this way and not down this way, right? What is it that leads people who are in a competitive situation or see competition in a situation or are created competitive adopt performance approach goals instead of performance avoidance goals? Very, very important question. One we've just begged up to this point. So we think expected competence is one possibility. If you're competitive and you think you're in a situation where you may not do well, that may lead to performance avoidance goals, which lead to worse outcomes. And there's other things too, but I just want to highlight the importance of that question, and I'll just highlight the one, expected competence. So if you think you're going to do well, that's going to lead to the approach track, and good outcomes, if you think you're going to do poorly, it might lead to the negative track. So that's one next step, and then I want to give you a couple of take-home messages, and then again I get into the application. So one thing I want you to remember, when you leave here and you go back to your family or you go back to your flat with your friends and you're forgetting about this American guy who came and talked to you earlier, I want you to remember two things, right? I want you to remember that competition can be good or bad for achievement outcomes. It depends on the goals you adopt. And I want you to remember this theoretically, but I most want you to remember this practically in your everyday life. Because we all have these competitive urges, we all find ourselves in these competitive situations, and ask yourself, what kind of goals do I typically adopt? And realize that if it's avoidance goals especially, you may want to revisit that and think about why and if you can change that. Okay, and then the second thing I want you to take home is a little broader. It's a hierarchical analysis needed to precisely and clearly explain motivation. If we just stopped at energization, we just stopped at competitiveness, and used only it to try to explain performance outcomes, we'd still be lost in it's zero, it's a no effect, that's it, right? But bringing in goals or direction as well as energization allows us to much more clearly understand how competition works its way out in competitive situations toward outcomes. And then here's the practical, here's the applied piece that I want you to take home as well. This requires a little bit of a backstory. So I do research in social psychology, personality psychology, sports psychology, educational psychology, industrial organizational psychology. Why? Because in all of those fields, in all of those disciplines, people care about doing well or avoiding doing poorly. Achievement motivation is really a broad topic, right? And so, in some of these disciplines, especially educational psychology, the strong argument that a lot of people make is competition is bad for students, and we need to get rid of it in students. We need to discourage competitiveness in students. Now, this is really, it's a philosophical as much as it is a scientific question, and I'm sure all of you have thoughts and feelings about that, and I I think there's room for a lot of diversity of opinion in that, but let me just share a few thoughts I have that may spring some questions, right? So they prompt some questions, which is what I'm going to do, I'm going to take in just a minute. So I think at minimum we need to acknowledge the tendency, the basic tendency for all of us to be competitive, or all of us to see others as competitive at minimum. And we need to teach about the benefits and costs of competitiveness. So I mentioned I have children. I have one of my kids here. I have 3 kids. They're now grown up, so this is a little bit less salient for me as it used to be. But when my kids were teenagers, they're right now they're 29 in 2 days, 27 and 24. So I started having kids when I was 11. No, I don't feel old enough to have a 29-year-old. He's the guy walking around and he's lost in the city right now. But when my kids were teenagers, you know, they like all teenagers, they started to think about sex and have feelings about sex. And as a parent, of course, you're panic-stricken, like what do we do now, you know, and how do we help them navigate this? And I could have taken the approach of, with my wife, we could have said, well, we're gonna get rid of their sexual desires, right? That's the easy approach, because then it's gonna make things a lot simpler for them and for us. And now, of course, that's ridiculous, right? That's just not gonna work. Instead, what we did is we talked to them about it, and we talked to them about the positives of sex, and about the pitfalls of sex, and about how to cope with their sexuality, right? And so I want to draw that analog to competitive desires. That it's probably not possible, even if we don't think competition's a good thing, it's probably not possible to drill it out of our students and say to them, don't worry about how the person next to you is doing, or you have those competitive urges, try to squash them, don't think about how others are doing. I'm going to argue that's like trying to tell your teenager, don't think about sex. It's a losing proposition. And instead I'm going to argue the better approach is to try to talk about the positives of competition and the negatives of competition and help them cope. Positively, it maybe can spur you on to work really hard and persist. The negatives being, it can be scary and make you not even want to enter a domain. It can interfere with relationships. So acknowledge the positives and negatives and then help kids cope with it. So that's my first point. And then I'm going to show my cards a little bit. I'm going to say that perhaps we can encourage a reconsideration of how competitive people are and how much people adopt performance approach and avoidance goals in everyday life. I'm actually in the camp where I think it'd be ideal for most students especially, maybe most workers, and maybe in everyday life, all of us, to be less competitive and more focused on improvement and growth. So I'm not ruling that out. I'm actually kind of in that camp of wanting that to be the case. But to me, that's kind of the ideal that we can move toward. And as we move toward that ideal, live in the reality that I just described with the analogy to sex, right? And on that note, I'll end with the word sex, okay? And I'll stop my talk. All right?
Research goals for the near future, and the second one, to whom are you in competition with?
Oh, wow, this is great. That second one especially. So what am I doing now? I'm really interested. That's a big one. He's smiling. He's got a big smile on his face, as you should. One of the things we're doing is we're taking this to that broader societal level. I was really, you can probably tell, I was really energized and excited about that work on Gini coefficient and taking it to the societal level of inequality. We're now taking it to race, and what we're doing is we're getting information on postal code in the United States, black and white is a major issue, as you all, I'm sure, are aware. So we have new data on 750 white participants, 750 black participants, and we get where they're living, in the postal code they're living, and we measure the amount of white-black difference in income in each postal code. So what we want to know is if you live in a postal code where there's a lot of racial income inequality, does that influence how much you think there's competition between blacks and whites? And does that lead to perceptions of discrimination and things like that? And early returns are indeed that we're showing these same kind of things, that race-based inequality leads to race-based competitiveness, which leads to high perceptions of discrimination and lack of trust, especially, and we think it's going to be especially in black participants. So that's what I'm really excited about. Who do I compete with? That's such a good question. What I find is that in my work, I compete with people who are a little older than me, who have done a little bit more than me. And what I find is that that can really spur me on to work really hard, but that sometimes it distracts me and discourages me. And so what I do is I really regulate my competitive desires, and when I find them being problematic, I just shift more toward improvement. So I don't try to get rid of my competitiveness, because I find sometimes it really helps me to work hard and helps motivate me in a positive way. But when I find it going a different direction, and it's different with in each situation, when I find it going in a different direction, I try to step out of it and go toward improvement. Thank you for asking. Other questions? Yes?
Why did you choose to focus on performance goals and not on mastery goals?
For this talk or in general?
In general.
In general. Okay. So, first of all, I became an achievement motivation researcher because I was a baseball player in college. I don't look like a baseball player, I look like a guy who just sits around and reads books. I understand that. I'm married, and I should be wearing my wedding ring over here, right? But my body type is much thinner than it used to be. I used to look like an athlete. And so that's why I could wear, anyway. So I got interested in these ideas from being an athlete. And I saw that my competitive urges were good in that context often, and that when I set the goal of trying to do well compared to other players, I would do well, and when I set the goal of trying to do poorly, I would do poorly. And this was ignored in the literature on Achievable. So then I was, in my academic life, shifting from the athlete to what you see in front of you, and I wanted to apply that to the literature on achievement goals. What I found is that they were only focused on mastery goals. It was all performance goals are bad, competition's bad, mastery's good, it's good for everything. So that didn't ring true for me, at least in the athlete realm. So I started to study it in the student realm, and I found that even in the student realm, competition isn't necessarily all bad, and mastery goals don't often get you good performance. They get you enjoyment. Let me say what a mastery goal is. A mastery goal is a standard you use for whether you're doing well or poorly is yourself, or the task demands. So it's, am I doing better than I've done before, or well compared to how I've done before? Am I doing poorly compared to how I've done before? That's different than performance goals, which are, am I doing well compared to others? Am I doing poorly compared to others? Right? And so in the literature, when I was back in the day, 25 years ago, when I was studying and doing my PhD, everyone in educational psychology in particular was saying, train your students to adopt mastery goals alone. And there was very much a negative statement about performance goals. And then nobody was looking at the approach avoidance distinction. They were only looking at approach goals. So what I did is I brought in two things. I brought in that approach avoidance distinction is really important. As you saw today, those are the different paths, right? Really important to see both of those paths. And then I brought in this idea that, you know what, competition isn't necessarily all bad, but you can also see I'm not a rah-rah, we need to compete more. I'm not that guy. I'm the guy who's saying, competition's here, it's not as bad, we should paint it with a black brush and say it's all bad like we have been. Let's put it to the scientific critical test, and when you do, you realize it can be bad in some instances, but it can also be good in some instances. It's more nuanced. Other questions? Yeah.
Is there any data explaining why trade competitiveness leads to both performance approach goals and performance avoidance goals?
So the question is, are there data showing why trade competitiveness leads to both of the type of goals?
Yeah. It's pretty counterintuitive.
Sorry?
It's pretty counterintuitive. At least it seems.
Yeah, for me, it made a bit of sense. So I actually theorized that ahead of time because I thought if you've got a general desire that is about others and doing well compared to others, it's probably going to make you adopt goals where you focus on others. And I'm an approach avoidance theorist, so I always think about approach do better than others, avoidance avoid employee compared to others. So for me, it makes a lot of sense that if you have the broad desire about how you're doing compared to others, you're going to narrow that focus of your goals. You're going to think about how you're doing relative to others in both a positive and negative sense. We don't have data on why, but that next step that I talked about was when you go the one route toward approach goals as opposed to avoidance goals. And that's where we're just starting to do some studies on that. Next time I come, I'll report on that. Right now I don't have data for you. I'll come back to try to find myself. Still be a lot of time. Other questions for me? Yeah.
Have you tried to replicate your studies in countries like Sweden, Norway, which are quite culturally different from the United States?
Yeah. Very, very astute question. So the United States is a very individualistic country. That spurs on a lot of individual comparisons of how am I doing compared to others. That's a very clear relationship. There are other countries, including the Scandinavian countries that were mentioned, where it's more collectivistic oriented, where you either try not to stand out or you just are encouraged to focus on your own performance. Finland is held up as the paragon of the best school system in the world, and they're a very mastery-based system. It's very flat, it's not hierarchical, it's an emphasis on improvement. In the Southeast Asia, there's a real focus on collectivism, so there's a focus on not standing out compared to others, so it's more avoidant-based, interestingly. So in Scandinavia, we still find the same kind of patterns that performance approach goals lead to better outcomes. In China and Southeast Asia, it's more complex. We find that avoidance goals aren't as negative in those countries for performance and other things as they are in the United States. And we think it's because it fits the cultural emphasis better. In China, you're socialized to not stand out, so that the focus is on avoidance and socialization. So if you adopt goals or avoidance, it might match the culture better and not be as problematic. Whereas in the US, the focus is on doing well, and so if you adopt avoidance goals, there's a mismatch in the culture. We think that that's part of what leads to the negative outcomes. Other questions? And I'll hang out afterwards if you are too shy to ask a question in the public sphere.
Yes, you said that economic heterogeneity stimulates perceived competitiveness, but maybe any heterogeneity stimulates that trait, that perception. Maybe any differences stimulate that perception.
Any differences, not just economic differences?
Not just economic. For example, ethnic, racial.
Say it again. For example?
Ethnic.
Yeah, okay. That's really interesting. So what he's raising is that what we've shown in our work is that economic heterogeneity or inequality leads to perceptions of competitiveness, people competing against each other. Maybe any difference, like an ethnic difference,
Or religious.
or religious differences, might lead to perceived competitiveness. That's really interesting. We can't rule that out as an explanation, and it's a really interesting idea that I think should be studied.
Yeah.
Very good. So let me stop there. I'm going to hang out up here. If you want to come up and ask me an individual question, I'll be here for a little while. And again, thank you for your attention. It's really a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.